Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented jointly by Energy Safety Canada and the Alberta Motor Transport Association. And today we're here to bring you the Spring 2021 ELD implementation update, and I'm joined by my co-presenter and friend, Andrew Barnes. Just before
Hello.
we get started, just before we get started here, a quick note, please do interact with us, submit some questions. You can submit that with the chat function there at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that chat icon and that will pop up a small box, and you can either enter that chat and send that to everyone, or you can direct that specifically to me and I'll queue up those questions. We will try and hold those questions to the end, but if we do get a lot on a particular topic, we may interject and have a quick side discussion before heading on. Also, if you are joining us via a mobile device today, you can click the three buttons on the bottom right-hand side and hit the raise hand, or pardon me, chat. I've got the raise hand circle though. I'll have to fix that. All right. Just moving on here. Also, you can give us a little bit of feedback. There is a participants button there at the bottom of your screen. You can indicate to go faster or slower, or answer any simple yes/no type questions that do pop up. We are going to do a quick check of that right now. So if you can see the presentation and hear clearly, please do click yes. And if not, click no. And either myself or one of my co-hosts will reach out to see if we can troubleshoot with you. And Jerry, well, you can't hear me, but I will get to you here shortly, or one of my co-hosts, Adrian, will reach out to you. So just hang tight. All right, the vast majority, everybody looks like it's working just fine. So with that, we'll move on to the core of the presentation. And as I said, today we have Andrew Barnes with the AMTA. He brings with him over 28 years in the commercial transportation industry and 20 years in management. You know it's a lot when you have to use the plus sign. He's got extensive experience working in the oil and gas industry, also with Alberta Justice and the Solicitor General with the Commercial Vehicle Enforcement Branch. So some great experience there. And presently, he is the Director of Compliance and Regulatory Affairs with the AMTA. And with that, Andy, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me out today. I appreciate the opportunity once again to work with Energy Safety Canada and communicate with PSAC as well too. This is a topic that is critically important to everybody right now and is top of mind. I'm just going to share my screen. ELD. So today we're going to be talking about ELDs, the implementation, a bit of a spring update, what's happening and where we're going with this new legislation and kind of how things are proceeding. And I think it's a topic on everyone's mind. I know over the past couple of weeks, my phone has been ringing constantly, which is a good thing, on questions and scenarios and what do we do in this case. So I think hopefully we can answer a lot of questions and enlighten some people today. Don't be afraid to ask any tough questions. If I don't know the answer, what we're going to do is we're going to record that question down, and I will get back to the group personally with an answer. I think hopefully you have a hard time stumping me on this topic, so we will we'll just slowly move forward. So today during the presentation, we're going to talk about details about some of the Canadian regulations, how to prepare, and what kind of staged enforcement we might be looking at or are looking at, differences between the regulations between Canada and the US. And that's really critical, especially when, especially within the energy sector. A lot of companies are based out of the US and have US equipment, regulatory timelines in Canada as far as what we see now, because we know that the legislative changes take place June 12th. That date isn't changing, but where there are some allowances. The third-party certification process, and then kind of what's happening in Alberta from everything that we've heard so far when it comes to provincially regulated carriers. So that's where we're going to go today. And why don't we start off kind of like looking at the objectives when it comes to ELDs? I think there's some misunderstanding out there around what the government and what we're hoping for between Energy Safety Canada and the AMTA. And really, the government of Canada is committed to a transportation system that's safe, obviously, and competitive for the national market. And I think that's critical. When we talk about improving safety on commercial vehicles, I don't think any of us will argue with that. But we also have the other part. What is nationally important too is that we have an even playing field across the board. So ensuring that people can't tamper with devices when it comes to certification, and holding everybody to the same level of accountability is critical for not only the government, Transport Canada, but I'm sure equally as it's important for Energy Safety Canada and the Alberta Motor Transport Association. The objectives of the amendments are to improve commercial vehicle safety again, administrative efficiencies, increase administrative efficiencies, and obviously compliance with the hours of service regulations. And I want to talk about that point. I think that's important because I don't think some people realize the increased efficiencies when it comes to ELDs. For those of you that have installed these and are working with your various suppliers and working within your companies, you probably realize this. I'm speaking with one of the COOs of one of the larger fuel carriers in North America. They haven't had more than a handful, 5 or 6 employees, really rebel against ELDs and how these operates. There's always going to be a few people that question this, but the overall improvements from paper logs are being accepted really, really well by drivers, as well as it makes your back office practices around auditing and things so much more efficient. And it really guides people through the regulations. One thing that's really kind of important when you think about this, though, is that doesn't exempt anybody from understanding and knowing the hours of service regulations, because that still is a training requirement under the National Safety Code. And it's also critically important that drivers are still trained in it. So just because the ELD will essentially tell you how much driving time you have left and stuff, we still have a responsibility as companies to follow the National Safety Code and all of the training. Next, the amendments will, in alignment with the US requirements, mandate the use of ELDs by drivers who are currently maintaining a driver's log. So this is a key point, and I'm going to mention this a couple times. When it comes to ELDs, think of it this way. An ELD is just simply replacing that paper book. So anytime under the current regulations that you are operating and you're required to fill out a paper logbook, you simply are now converting over to an electronic logging device, which needs to be certified under Transport Canada. So if you follow that general rule, you can't go wrong. Anytime you need a paper logbook now, you will need an ELD in the future, and or anytime that you have an exemption now, like the 160, which we'll talk about a bit more, you don't need a paper log now, you will not need an ELD in the future. The amendments also require motor carriers to acquire and install ELDs in their vehicles when they operate outside of the 160. And there's my point that I was thinking of. I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. Really, it's just that simple. When you think about it, if you're operating within the 160 kilometer radius, you do not need to operate under an ELD. If you go out at any time, though, there is no exemption. So currently there is no exemption for not having an ELD. So I typically operate within the, I'm going to call it the Grand Prairie area. I always stay within the 160 kilometer radius. I don't need to operate a paper logbook. I return to my home terminal the same night. I follow all of the rules under the 160 radius rule. I'm good. But any time that, let's say I had to go to Red Deer, there is no exemption for that. So if you think about operating that generalized statement of anytime you need a paper logbook now, you definitely need a logbook later. There is an exemption for there is an exemption, and we'll talk about those exemptions briefly coming up. Do we have 6 questions there, Andy? Is it worth taking a couple now, or should we move on?
You know what? We do have a pile of questions, but they are kind of specific, and a bunch of them I know you're going to answer, so we're just going to hold on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, electronic logging devices, some of the regulatory highlights. So one of the first things that was developed by Transport Canada was the technical standard. And essentially that technical standard was developed by the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators. And that's all of the provincial officials that deal with hours of service. And they came up with what is the whole goal and what are we going to require these electronic devices to do. And that is now really how all of the devices in Canada are manufactured. Naturally, they looked at the technical standard in the United States when developing that, but that's kind of the basis of what does this device have to do in Canada? And when it comes to third-party certification later, how are we going to measure against the anything? How are we going to measure against that to determine whether or not that certify that device? The next point is the fact that, just like I said, all ELDs will need to be certified by an accredited third party in accordance with criteria set out in the technical standards and regulations. So this is this big snag, and this is the real big difference between the rules in the United States and Canada, is that in Canada, we don't have self-certification. All of the devices that are being used for hours of service have to be certified. There's only one certifying company right now, and that's FP Innovations. Down here is the link. And if I click on the link now, let's see if this works for me and everything works out great. Can we see that web page, Andrew?
Yes, we've got that up.
Perfect. When you see this, you can see the list of certified ELDs, and we don't have anybody there yet. Well, I'm sure you're all aware of that, but just so you know, this isn't coming as a surprise, and we're moving into a little bit of a last minute game. There's also a hyperlink for Transport Canada's website too, where you're not going to see anything listed. So I think it's important that we understand that all devices need to meet this Canadian certification standard. They have to have that certification process done to it, and your ELD supplier needs to ensure that they are compliant with that. Now, we're going to get into this staged enforcement because I don't think that all of the ELD providers are going to be good to go right off for June 12th. But that's okay because we've been talking about that. I know the Petroleum Safety Association or Petroleum Services Association of Canada, Energy Safety Canada, as well as the AMTA have been discussing this with Transport Canada as well as the CCMTA, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So let's move on to exceptions now, because this is a topic that is always a hot one. People have older equipment out there and they operate under permits. So let's go through these exceptions. A commercial vehicle will be exempt if they operate under a permit. So typically in Alberta, we see 2 types of permits. Most predominant for the energy area is the oil field permit, but we also have a fertilizer permit out in Saskatchewan, and the carriers can obtain too for hauling fertilizer in the spring. So anytime that you operate under a federal permit, and it has to be only a federal permit, or you have a permit issued on behalf of the federal legislation by Alberta, an oil field exemption, cumulative oil field exemption permit, you don't need to operate an ELD. So that's kind of critical. Next one, operate a motor vehicle to which an exemption has been issued under this act. So this is another one that is very key too. So right now, I'm not aware of, and it's only been a couple days or a couple weeks actually since I looked into this, I'm unaware of any exemptions that have been issued. I chatted with the Canadian Trucking Alliance, who's been in contact with Transport Canada on a regular basis, and we don't know of any exemptions that have been issued by Transport Canada. It's my understanding that the exemptions will be fairly hard to obtain, if any at all will be issued. So just something to keep in mind. I think if you have a case to be made, and I'm going to give you an example of a possible case in a little bit. Vehicles that are subject to a rental agreement under 30 days. So this is where we have a breakdown. We have to go over to Penske or whoever you're using and get another vehicle. If you have a lease agreement for under 30 days, you're also going to be exempt. And this is probably one of the most popular questions when it comes to ELDs, and that's operating a vehicle manufactured before the model year 2000, especially in the energy services industry. So when we look at that, we know there's lots of service rigs out there. I was in the energy industry working with Andrew in the past, and we have lots of older vehicles because of the specific nature of the industry out there. And what's very key with this is we're getting questions on, well, the engine year is 1999, but you know, the year sold on the decal or the registration says it's a 2000. What do I go by? So I did a bit of research into this, and the key to this is determining what the manufacturer's model year is. And how you determine that, it's probably best to actually call the manufacturer. So whether it's Kenworth, Peterbilt, Freightliner, whoever the case may be, and say, look, I need to find out the model year of my vehicle. It's always contained within the serial number. So within the serial number, it's a couple of those digits are designated to the model year, and that's how you determine whether you need an ELD or not. The one thing where I can see a possible exemption being issued is if you have a vehicle with the engine built in 1999, like I was faced with, yet the model year was 2000, there's no OBD2 port to plug into for this equipment. So that might be a good example of when an exemption would be issued. So I think you'll see exemptions very rare, but when we have something very logical, something that we can explain, such as that, a key difference between the engine technology and having the ability to plug in ELD into and not, and the manufacturer year being 2000, there may be a few differences out there. One of the other things that we also need to be aware of is malfunctioning ELDs. And I've heard of this, and guaranteed we're going to run into these problems as we start implementing this equipment. Many of you have, and all of you that have equipment have no doubtably run into snags where the equipment quits working. And essentially, the driver may use paper logs for a maximum of 14 days upon returning from the home terminal from the currently planned trip, if it takes longer than 14 days. So for most people out there, most companies, I would say it's a rarity to have the 14 days, except possibly in the oil field. This is where I see people being out on a lease site, they're operating in a camp situation, and they could be operating for longer than a 14-day period. you're going to have to keep detailed notes as to why you're not operating an ELD, when that ELD quit working, and where you are. Because in an audit situation, or if you get stopped by the sheriff's department or the RCMP or whoever on the way back, you need to be able to explain that. And the more records you have, whether it be within the company that the ELD had a problem, and or in your paper logbook, this is when the problem started, this is where I am, we're operating in camp situation, it's documented right away. I don't think you're going to have a problem explaining it. Okay, this is the one thing that I said was especially important and very key for a lot of the energy sector. And that is the differences between the regulations in the United States and Canada. First off, we know there's hours differences. That's a given. The number of hours you can operate in the US and Canada. But when it comes to ELDs, the big difference is the certification of the ELD. In the US, you can self-certify. You can go on the FMCSA website. There's a very large list of ELDs that have made the certification down there. When that ELD comes across the border, it needs to be certified in Canada. Just because it was certified by the FMCSA does not make it legal in Canada. So it's critical that if you're operating and using a company out of Florida, that device, you have your ELD provider submit their ELD for testing in Canada and certification in Canada, because it's not going to be recognized as an approved ELD. So critical that you look at that. I think all of you that have ELDs, you need to reach out to your provider. You need to find out when their ELD is going to be certified. And if they're in the certification process, and or in some cases, if they're from the United States, if they realize they need to be certified in Canada. So that's super, super critical. So outside that, there's no real differences. The hours remain the same in Canada before and after the changes to the federal hours of service regulations. All we're doing now is saying again, hey, don't use a paper logbook. Whenever you used a paper logbook in the past, you need to use a certified ELD. That's the big difference. The other key is understanding that any ELD that's in Canada, doesn't matter whether it came from the US and was certified in the US, it needs to be certified by the Canadian standard and to the Canadian regulations. So it's going to have that FP Innovation stamp on it and that Transport Canada stamp. So regulatory timeline. So I talked to Andrew about this. I also gave Andrea a call from PSAC, and we talked about this. And this is a big one for all of the carriers and energy services companies out there, because there's nobody listed. Hey, where are we? Are we going to be prepared for ELDs to come into play June 12th? So this was a pretty hot topic at the beginning of the year because we didn't have anything in place. I know that both Energy Safety Canada, PSAC, as well as the AMTA and Canadian Trucking Alliance spoke with the federal minister, and he was quite committed to keep the date as it stands, June 12th, for the regulation to be put in place. So really what we've done is everyone has worked together, and we're all very much tightly aligned on developing an ELD enforcement strategy. And this is where all provinces have begun meeting on the development of the plan. Is it expected that this plan should be fairly well completed by the end of May? And that's where we're going to see this staged enforcement. There's not going to be enforcement June 12th. If you don't have an ELD, you're not going to get a ticket. You're not going to be placed out of service. So that's critical to know. As the months go by, we may look at warnings in the fall, and I don't have an exact timeline yet. And by the time that we hit the 1 year period, I think we could fully expect full enforcement on ELDs to be taking place. So there is a plan in place. We know that ELDs haven't been certified yet. The Transport Canada understands that. And all of the associations are working with these groups that are doing this. Not only are we working with Transport Canada and the provinces, as is developed, the provinces will update their policies naturally. It's also clear that the provinces are coming in, they're very aligned with their enforcement policies. The one that's kind of out there is Quebec right now, and they say, hey, we're not going to do anything right now until this is sorted out. Okay, that's fine, that's great. But I think what's also important is we're taking the extra steps. I know the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and I didn't speak to Andrea about this. I know that the Canadian Trucking Alliance and a few other groups have talked with the Canadian Chiefs of Police. Transport Canada is getting the message out to more than just provincial officials, because we know that there's many more enforcement agencies out there, and this is all coming together, I'd say, in a pretty unified fashion. So I can't guarantee you that there isn't going to be any hiccups out there, but I think generally speaking, between the CTA, Energy Safety, PSAC, and some other groups too, we've very strategically and very methodically worked together to come up with a plan to make sure this implementation is smooth and that we do have this staged enforcement happen, because we can't have a whole bunch of people. We can't have the industry shut down naturally. We can't have a whole bunch of people get into trouble neither. So ELD training conditions, this is something to considerations. This is another point that Andrew and I were talking about prior to doing this, and I thought I'd add a slide on this because I think this is critical. If you haven't started looking for an ELD provider now, and you were going to require one, I would recommend that you do this as soon as possible. Work with your ELD provider and make sure that they're in the certification process or they have a plan going forward, because that's going to be critical. Because the implementation within your companies is going to take some time. So what are the major changes drivers can expect if they have not used an ELD before? So some of the changes would be moving to an electronic device. Obviously, some of the drivers, especially in the trucking industry, are older, may not be up to speed on devices like that. Edits that have to be done with a logbook can no longer be done by a driver. They need to be done by your back office and or somebody within the company. And it's got to be recorded in the correct way. The next thing that's kind of popped up was who else, and this is a critical one because people never think about this when it comes to hours of service. Who else in my organization needs to be trained on ELDs? And this truth is whether you're operating under the old regulations or new regulations, but anybody that dispatches, has control of a driver, is doing audits or anything around a driver's fatigue, level of fatigue or hours of service needs to be trained. So not only do they need to understand the regulations like we talked about, they also need to be trained up on how does this ELD work? How does it operate? How does the back office function work of it? So if we get stopped by let's say the RCMP, and you're required to email a copy of your electronic log, not only does the driver know how to do this, but your dispatcher knows how to do this. The HSE department knows how to do this well too. So everybody who works around this equipment needs to be trained. Why is it important for team members other than drivers to be trained? And that falls totally within that whole fatigue management era. We all have to understand what our drivers are going through. We have to understand the rules, the regulations, and what's critical for them. And how do I ensure the best experience when I'm onboarding ELDs? And do you know what the answer to that is? We've talked about it already, and that's training and acceptance of this. I can't honestly say I've met a whole other, I've chatted with a few people, but not very many people that have a lot negative to say about an ELD. It generally speaking makes the driver's life a lot easier. I can see for the energy sector, there's going to be more challenges where people are working on sites, but they also drive. So they're going to have to gain access to computers and record hours, not typically in a truck and things like that. But I think as you go through all of those different scenarios in your company, and as you work with your providers, you're going to have to develop that specific type training, which will only benefit your company. One of the next things we're going to talk about is just Alberta provincially regulated carriers. And this is where you're operating solely within the province of Alberta, point to point. You hold a provincial national safety certificate, so you're not leaving the province. You're operating under a provincial certificate. You still will operate under the provincial regulations. As far as I know, the province does not have any plans right now to replace the provincial regulations, nor are we expecting this anytime soon. We know that the province has looked at adopting the federal regulations down the road, but right now, I wouldn't be concerned about this. If this concentrates, if you're a federal carrier, concentrate on that. But also be wary if you're thinking about moving to just a provincial authority, is that going to benefit you? Because down the road, I would expect the province to entertain this at least. That would be my hedged bet if I was betting on the situation. So just keep that in mind. So that's kind of where we are with ELDs. You know, it's I thought I covered most of the topics. I'm sure we've got a few questions now, Andrew. Do you want to open up, or how do you want to handle this?
Yeah, I've been collecting questions like a madman here, and I think you've answered quite a few, but there are a few specifics in here that I'll dig out. Will ELDs be required for operators with the BC heavy trailer endorsement, specifically those who drive infrequently and actually tow a trailer? And then there's two related questions in here that'll tack on. How would you recommend to run pickups that are registered under 4,500 kg, but once they tow a trailer, they're now overweight and generally require a logbook? So those two actually come from both Brendan and Justin.
Okay, those are two really good questions. So the first question is, I'm not aware of that endorsement, to be honest with you, but I take it there is an endorsement under the license to operate a commercial vehicle with a trailer, which then puts you over 4,500 kilograms. And if you are regulated federally, which is a vehicle or a combination of vehicles in excess of 4,500, and you operate with a federal certificate, you're operating in a federal condition, there is no exemption. So you definitely would need to operate using an ELD, okay? So very clear, if you simply operate, so you've got the condition where you generally don't and you need to pull a trailer once a year. Unfortunately, your company can take the time to unqualify you and move you to a light vehicle driver. But then when they move you back as a commercial vehicle driver, there's requirements for number of hours in the prior 14 days and things like that, that all have to be taken into consideration. So special attention has to be done if if you want it. Very seldom it's that rare that I would move somebody if I was working in that company, or I would recommend management that they move people. And for the pickup question, the same situation applies. You hook up to a trailer. In Alberta, we allow the trailers to have a registered weight on them, and most provinces don't. And when you combine the weight, you're over 4,500, you definitely need an ELD. If you unhook from that trailer and you're under, that's great. You may not need one, but the next time you hook up, you're going to again. So you're flipping back and forth. So there's definitely no exemption for either one of those situations that I'm aware of. Someone may apply for an exemption. I'm not too sure that they would get it, but you would definitely have to operate under the federal regulations. So next question, Andrew.
You bet. Just flipping back and forth here. Any exemption for tow trucks is one, and that 160K, do you still need to prove hours of work if you operate within that?
Okay, let's go tow trucks first. So tow trucks I actually was talking with a couple companies, and tow trucks are going to be one of those situations where it's touch and go for hours. We get out to the scene of a wreck, we're being held there, the RCMP don't shut down the road right away, the investigation takes longer. You are still going to have to operate under an ELD. You're going to be held to those hours, and I do not know of any exemptions around that. So it's going to be super critical that you're cognitive of the fact that, you know what, there's hey, I've got to get off the road to a safe area, exemption under the federal regulations, that you move to just a safe area where you can shut down off of the highway. But that would have to be documented very carefully on your ELD device. So it is going to cause, I know it's going to cause some, I'm going to call it indigestion for the towing industry, but these are some of the things that we're going to have to learn to work around. And maybe you start working with and advising the different enforcement agencies when you show up on location, how you're going to handle it, and or educate people as to these new requirements of the rules. What was the second part of that question again, Andrew?
The 160 kilometer radius, do you still need to prove the hours of work?
Yes. So you still need to record. None of the legislative changes have changed. You still need your start time, your end time. It's got to be recorded in the back office. It's got to be able to be produced by a peace officer upon demand by a peace officer. And Andrew, remind me about that. What we can do is send the interpretation guide out. There's an example in the federal interpretation guide of how to record those hours. And I always send people there because, you know what, it's specific. It tells you exactly how to record those hours, and it ensures that nobody's going to get into trouble. So when we send out, I think you'll probably send out the presentation, or we can send out, that's one of the things that I'll commit to sending out is that ELD interpretation. Because again, none of the rules have changed. It's only for the fact that we're replacing paper with an electronic device now.
Right. And there have been a couple of questions about this presentation. We are recording it for posterity. So we will have this posted on the Energy Safety Canada webpage under On Demand if you wanted to revisit this or share this with some colleagues. And we'll also put a copy of the presentation from Andy, and we'll add that link in there that he spoke about as well.
Awesome. Other questions?
Oh, a lot here. Just some of the older ones that got in here first. You mentioned that the carriers with an oil well cycle permit are not required to have an ELD. Does this apply to only the drivers listed on the permit, or is it blanket for the carrier that holds the permit? Now, I do think Andrea of PSAC did answer this in the chat, but for anyone who missed it or is on the phone, we should probably get that addressed.
So maybe what we should do is Andrea, if you can chime in, if you can unmute yourself. But my understanding would be any driver that is operating under the permit, and they would have to be listed under the permit. If you're not operating under the permit, then that's fine. You would have to have an ELD for sure.
And Andrea, do you mind kind of chiming in here?
Yep. Thank you for unmuting me, and thanks for pointing out that for a few of you, I have answered some of your questions in there. There's too many Andrews and Andreas on this phone call, so it's confusing for all of us here. Yeah, so I have confirmed we deal with this on the PSAC side. Many of our members have that oil field services exemption permit. So I have confirmed that if you do have that permit, you are exempt from that requirement to install ELDs, and that confirmation was with Transport Canada. However, there are two scenarios where you may have a permit and you can still require an ELD. So the first is if you have multiple drivers for single vehicles. So some are hours of service permit drivers and others are not. So if you have a driver that is not a permit driver, then that would be a scenario where you would require an ELD. Then the second one is if you have the same trucks for company non-permit activities. So if you're doing load pickup, deliveries, repairs, equipment upgrades, those pieces that do not fall under an oil field services exemption permit, then again, you will require an ELD on that vehicle as well too. So if you don't fall under those two scenarios, some people have operations where they are very distinct about separating their vehicles, then you are not required to install ELDs at this time on those vehicles that do fall under the permit.
And then one other piece, Andrea, while I've got you on the line here, can you speak to if there's a listing of companies who was applying to have their devices certified through FP Innovations?
Yeah, and again, I sort of mentioned it in there in the scrolling of the thing, but I anticipate that my answers are lost there too. There is not a list right now for who is applying for these certifications. So right now, I just want to clarify actually that FP Innovations has not certified any ELDs at this time. So we do not have a list of certified ELDs. That list will, once something is certified, there is a spot on the Transport Canada website that will have the list of certified ELDs. Like I said, that list is empty right now. As for who is applying to do that, unfortunately, it's limited to you having to ask each independent vendor and say, are you interested in going through that process and are you going through it or not? So there's no list out there that says, you know, the following companies are in the process of applying or in doing that. And the reason for that is that some companies have indicated early on that they were interested due to cost situations and those types of decisions. They've decided not to pursue the certification at this time. And so because of that, obviously they've either withdrawn from the process or done that. And so there is no list to really keep, you know, tabs on that fluid situation that's going on. So your best bet is to look at those ELDs that are out there right now that would meet your criteria for your specific situation. And then to contact each of those vendors and then ask them if they are interested in doing that certification process. And if they are pursuing that, then where they are in that process.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Andrea. Glad you could make the call.
No problem. And if you have other questions, just unmute me again and I'm happy to respond.
You bet. Another couple of questions back to you, Andy. This might be specific to the provider, but I'll be honest, I'm not too up to date and I'm not sure. Will the ELD provide us with prorate information, or do we have to log that separately?
Generally speaking, your IVMS or your GPS provider will provide you with that prorate information. Even some of the newer handheld ELD providers will do that as well too. So some of them have a dongle, a Bluetooth device where you plug into the OBD2 port and everything is done by hand unit. My understanding is that pretty much all of the vendors will have that prorate IFTA tracking for you. but just double check with your provider.
Okay, very good. And then at a roadside inspection, is the electronic copy of Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 sufficient, or does that need a paper copy still?
That's a good question.
We'll have to look into that one.
Yeah, I would say electronic copy should be sufficient, but let's double check that one.
We'll have to check with enforcement.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and then ELDs that allow individual drivers to provide their own devices. Is there a requirement to have that ELD mounted or secured to the vehicle, or no?
No, not that I'm aware of. No, as long as I know in the U.S. there's a requirement to be able to see it. From what I remember and what I understand, is that the ELD must be accessible. There is no requirement for that in Canada. So if you are Bluetooth into the ELD software or the equipment on your truck, as long as you can produce it when you're stopped roadside, and that it's available and it's handy, and you can update it at every current change of duty status, and make your notes in there, you're going to be good to go.
All right, very good. And is there still the mandate to have the ELDs connected directly to the vehicle ECM?
No, and this is where that Bluetooth piece comes in. If you are connected with Bluetooth, that is good enough. There's no hardwire requirement anymore. So as technology progresses, so has some of the requirements under the regulation.
Okay. And then this is kind of a specific one. In farming situations, do the same regulations apply? Now, I know you noted the fertilizer exemption that's possible, but I'm not sure what they're getting at in terms of farm vehicles. Can you comment?
Yeah, so when we look at farming, there are no federal exemptions outside of a 3-axle unit for primary harvest products. So whether it's like ocean stuff or forestry, there's might be some exemptions, and or farming specifically, anything over a 3-axle device, as it's currently listed in the regulations. If you require a logbook now, you will if you're a commercial farmer, or sorry, just a farmer, not commercial. If you're a farmer, there is no exemption. If you require a paper logbook now, you will require a logbook later. So double check on that, because just because you're a farmer doesn't exempt you.
Okay, and I think we've answered a couple of these. I'm just going to skip ahead. From Justin, since ELDs record everything, what about lease moves? I'm assuming they mean rig moves. Since not on a public roadway, they are not normally recorded on a paper logbook.
So with an ELD, there's a requirement for yard moves. And any yard move, and I don't have it in front of me, I believe it's 5 kilometers or more, 5 kilometers an hour or more, the ELD will be required to automatically kick you. So if you're doing a lease movement, maybe you're where you're not going to be required to record stuff now, this device is going to start recording. So you need to be cognizant of that and make sure that you clearly list that you're on site, you're on duty, and that you are doing a site move. In your remarks section would be my recommendation.
All right. Just lost my place there. Sorry about that. So a comment here from Derek that we might have to look into. He's citing 77.1 about the device requiring to be mounted. And what he's citing here is a motor carrier shall ensure that each commercial vehicle that operates is equipped with an ELD that meets the requirement of the technical standard, and shall ensure that it is mounted in a fixed position during the operation of the commercial vehicle and is visible to the driver when the driver is in a normal driving position. So might be something we can take and get an interpretation on.
Let's do that. You know what? That might be an oversight of mine. Good point. So we're going to get back to the group on that one. So good catch. Thanks for bringing that up. That's something that slid by me.
Okay, very good. Now, as you did mention, there are no fines or penalties in place right now with that staged enforcement. What does it look like going ahead? Do they have penalties prescribed or outlined?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think any of the penalties will change. I mean, federally right now, when you have a violation, this is a federal appearance notice is sent and it's an automatic court appearance. I know there is some talk about moving to a specified penalty, but right now I'm not aware of any changes. So again, that will be determined in a provincial court setting.
Okay, very good. And then just to answer another couple of questions, given the immense interest in this topic, Andy, in another few months, maybe in the fall, when we have a better understanding and there's more information out there, we can definitely revisit this if we have demand from our industry stakeholders, or if we have significant changes. So everyone can please stay tuned for that. And I just committed you, Andy, to doing another webinar with us. So.
You know what? That's a great idea because I guarantee you we're going to see some changes between now and then, some fine tuning to this enforcement strategy. We're going to run across some hiccups, and we're also going to learn a little bit more about some of the idiosyncrasies in the regulations that maybe we missed, like that device has to be in plain sight. That's something that I myself missed that we're going to get back to you. I'm going to double check and we're going to get back to everyone on.
Yep, very good. Okay, let's see here. There have been so many questions, and I do thank everyone. It's great to have this kind of discussion. Just having a one-way between the two of us gets a little boring here. So from Julie Ray, is there an exemption for employee drivers that rarely drive, maybe only 3 days a month? Do they need an ELD or can they use paper? I think they're going to need that ELD, Julie, but Andy?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely need an ELD. And this is one of those tough situations where you still need your previous hours too. So my recommendation is that's where that training piece and implementation piece within your company, we need to find out about all these little situations and then start planning for training, because maybe we need to have a computer which is accessible by those employees that rarely drive so that they can log their hours. 90% of the time, Andy Barnes works from 8 till 4 p.m. or 8 till 5 p.m. I still have to record that information through a computer or through a device or whatever the case may be, because when I'm ready to drive, if I don't, I am going to be in violation.
Right. Okay, we are quickly coming to the end of our time, and there are a few questions we didn't get to, or maybe we've missed them. I didn't see them in the chat. But just before we wrap up, we do have a poll to offer up to the audience. So that should show up on your screens here shortly. Couple of questions. How prepared is your company for the ELD implementation? So we do have a few options there. We've got a solution in place. We're in the process of implementing. Well, we have a plan. Maybe you're just starting to think about it. Maybe you're exempt and you're not going to do anything if you're provincial or only oil field exempt. Or maybe you're here just as a prime contractor, or you want to understand the needs of the services that work for you. So please let us know. And then again, which association are you affiliated with? The AMTA, Energy Safety Canada, or both of us, or perhaps neither. So give that another minute. About half the field is reported in there. And Andy will be sure to share this with the AMTA so we can all understand our stakeholders a little bit better. And then I think we're going to wrap up. Again, if anybody didn't get a question answered, submit that in to safety@Energy Safety Canada, and either Andy Barnes or I will get back to you. For upcoming presentations that we have that you may be interested in. We do have next week on April 14th, the Alberta Workers' Compensation branch is presenting on Bill 47 legislative changes to know what's important for employers. So please join us there. And then April 27th, we have a webinar on naturally occurring radioactive material norms. Those of you who operate, more to the north and more to the west are going to be more interested in that. On April 28th, join us for a special Day of Mourning Remembrance. We have special guest Wendy Ellen Niddle talking about the death of her son Blaine. Day of mourning, of course, is the day we remember those who fell in the line of their work or employment. And Blaine did work in the oil field services industry, and he did die in a automobile accident. So please join us for that. May 5th, we have a special presentation on fit for duty challenges a year after COVID. Now, this isn't about COVID, but it actually deals with drug and alcohol testing. And we have a presenter from Can-Am who does testing, who will have some interesting stats and some insight to what we're seeing or the information that they're seeing. And then May 12th, psychological injuries in the workplace. This is another presentation from the Alberta WCB and how to deal with those types of issues. So with that, I think we are going to wrap up here a few minutes before the top of the hour. I'm just going to check the chat here. You know what? I think we're going to save some of these questions. I'll forward them on to you, Andy, and we'll see if we can get back to anyone who we missed. Lauren, I'm looking at you. And again, the presentation will be on the Energy Safety Canada website in a day or two under Webinars on Demand if you want to revisit. And we'll get Andy's presentation in PDF form on there as well, and the associated materials that Andy referenced.
Well, thank you for having me out. It was a pleasure working with everyone to do the ELD session today. Hopefully, I think we all learned something. So we're looking forward to doing another one down the road, which I am looking forward to. Thank you again, everybody, and Andy for having us.
Oh, anytime. Glad to get this information out to all of our stakeholders. Everyone should receive a feedback survey here in the next half an hour to 45 minutes. Please let us know what you thought of the presentation. What was the number one takeaway that you had? What's one thing we can improve upon? And what other presentations would you like to see from Energy Safety Canada and our partners, the ANTA? So thank you very much, and we hope to see you next week.